going to see our colleague from IOM online? Is she? Can you put her on the screen? On commence? Commence? Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Scott Weber, the president of Interpeace. Thank you very much for being here and for being online as well. I know we have competition with another session on Ukraine at the moment, but we're going to make sure everyone wants to watch the replay of this session. Now, the session today is titled Breaking Silos, Situating Humanitarian Response to Foster Sustainable Peace. And of course, the theme of that is to understand the nexus, the HDP nexus, Humanitarian Development and Peace nexus. Now, all of us who have worked in this field for some years know that the peace and development component of the nexus has been quite well examined and populated with experience. The development and peace angle as well. The part of the nexus that is the least explored and somehow the most controversial is the humanitarian and peace relationship. And that's the one we're going to be exploring today. Now, just to situate us, let's recall that 85% of humanitarian crises today are conflict-related, and that 2/3 of conflicts are protracted conflicts of 8 years or more, which means, practically speaking, that the humanitarian, development, and peace actors are all cohabitating, in fact, in the same environments. So we're not talking about a sequential approach in any way. There are a few other insights that I would like to make at the beginning, just to situate this conversation and to provide some parameters so that we don't go over issues that have been well explored in either in other sessions at this conference or in our previous work. The first is to remember that in the lives of a Somali, a Yemeni, or any of the people that we are supporting, these issues are all intertwined. They don't do humanitarian assistance from 9 to 11, and then some development from 11 to 3, and then some peace building from 3 to 6. For them, it's all intertwined in the complexity of their lives. The challenge that we face as an international community is that we are siloed, and that it's our task to reflect as much as humanly possible, as much as institutionally possible, the coherence of the issues as they are experienced and lived by the communities concerned. So we're not going to talk about whether or not it is integrated. The nexus est une évidence. It is something that in the lives of the local people is just life and the challenges that they face. So the onus is on us to be reflective of that complexity. Two is that when we engage with people in these countries, they always, no matter what situation they're in, including in humanitarian crises, they always define their needs in a longer-term perspective than the outside world does. And we have to respect and reflect that longer-term perspective and thus a sustainability perspective in everything that we do. Not just work on food aid, but work on food security. And think of casting everything that is done in that longer-term perspective. The third point I'd like to say up front is that, and this is to reassure our humanitarian colleagues, is that no one on this panel, and certainly not its facilitator, is suggesting that humanitarians become peace builders. No. They must retain and protect, and we must all protect the humanitarian space. However, humanitarian actors do need to understand the footprint that they leave and through their short-term interventions. And the key question being, how can their short-term humanitarian assistance leave behind longer-term positive footprints, positive impacts on social cohesion and trust within communities, self-reliance and resilience? So it's not that humanitarians should become peace builders, but they do need to understand the longer-term impact of their work and adjust accordingly. And the fourth point to say up front is that when we talk about peace in the Nexus, we're not talking about capital P peace. We're not talking about how can humanitarian action contribute to the negotiations between President Zelensky and President Putin. We're not talking about that. We're talking about lowercase p for peace, meaning how can actions, humanitarian action in this case, contribute to social cohesion within communities and their own self-reliance. So just to situate, we're not going to go back over those points. Those are set aside. Now we're going to be exploring the challenges of making that work. And we have hopefully we're going to hear some actionable insights from the panel, and we hope that these offer some guidance for our actions after this event. So we have 4 amazing speakers with us today. The first is Hervé Delphin, the head of Unit Strategic Communication and Foresight at the European External Action Service. Thank you, Hervé, for being with us. We have Hannah Rose Holloway, the Humanitarian Disarmament and Peacebuilding Coordinator at the Danish Refugee Council. Thank you, Hannah, for being with us. We have Erika Moret, who's Senior Researcher, International Sanctions at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Thank you, Erika. And a change of program. Ugochi Daniels, the Deputy DG of IOM, is no longer with us, but very ably represented online by Angelica Broman, who's the Senior Advisor for the HDP Nexus at IOM. So, to kick off the conversation, I'm going to turn to Hervé first. Hervé, from your experience, and you of course have a job at Capital now, at the headquarters now, but you have a long field experience behind you that we're really keen to mine for insights into this issue. What, for you, are the factors that permit the collaboration between actors of these 3 sectors to be effective?
Thanks very much for finding me in this panel. As you rightly mentioned, I have a past life in the humanitarian field. It's indeed, it was better. It's working. Okay, great. No, thank you for having me in this panel. And indeed, I have a past life very much weighted to humanitarian action and foreign policy. And so since the 90s, I've been on different front lines in Africa, in the Middle East, and Central Asia. And indeed, we've been confronted all the time to this conundrum of saving lives from the humanitarian perspective in contexts which are highly conflictual and where we are not the only ones to intervene. So how do you put that together? Interestingly, as you said, if you go back into the history of the humanitarian policy at the EU level, it started with the classical nexus of the LRRD, the Linking Relief, Rehabilitation and Development. That was what was at the end of the 90s really the key topic. And then we moved on to something that were gaining traction was the resilience. And then we moved to the nexus, and then now we move to the triple nexus. And in parallel to that, there was indeed this idea of developing more integrated approach. So the history has been littered with concepts. And the reality on the ground have hardly changed, where you've got the humanitarian, the development, the military, and the diplomat that are there trying to address the complexity of those crises and how you make them work together. I think on the humanitarian development, we make some good headways in working together, and we've experimented and with also people in the room here in the Middle East, developing the joint humanitarian development frameworks to try to synchronize both in strategic and sector terms, but also in terms of the action on the ground, the different actors, bringing them together. The development and the humanitarian part. With the political part or the security part, it's been more complex. It's been more complex because probably there is a mutual suspicion in the first place, military and humanitarian, although they are, I would say, always on the front line, they don't necessarily like to talk to each other. But there is a positive story here, is that also at the EU level, we've seen the emergence of a civil-military doctrine that has evolved over time, getting a better understanding of what are the humanitarian requirements, and on the one hand, on the other hand, what are the specificity of CIDP. And I recall at the time of EU for Chad, one thing we did at ECHO, we got involved into the design of the concept of operation very early on. And then we set up liaison officers that were in the field that were able to constantly help deconflicting. So that we put in place different elements. So that goes also from, I would say, learning how the others work, operate, the modus operandi. I think one element is also important is recognition of the distinct mandates, and that no one has a temptation to do what the others is supposed to do. And I would add that there is an element of a joint assessment. Joint knowledge of the situation on the ground is absolutely key. Sometimes it may be wrongly perceived like the humanitarians are cooperating with the security and may give rise to suspicion of intelligence sharing. And I think this is something that we need to be very careful. I recall at the time when I was dealing with Afghanistan, the Taliban really made that a strong point. And for them, white men in white cars, they were all together, either intelligence or humanitarians into the same boat. So what I saw that was important is joint analysis, better understanding of the modus operandi. But one thing that I find is that where the humanitarians, while saving lives, it's difficult sometimes to compromise. And I think this notion, maybe we can dig into this, is what does it mean compromising in the sense of understanding the logic of others while continuing to deliver life-saving activities and work with the different humanitarian organizations. And I think this is an area where probably it doesn't run naturally, I would say. And maybe this is something we can come back, but I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, you've touched on a number of points that we're going to come back on, especially this issue of joint analysis. And I know, Hannah, we talked about this earlier, and as a multi-mandate organization, the Danish Refugee Council is, the issues of how your colleagues are naturally doing an integrated analysis is part of your modus operandi. But what do you see from the Danish Refugee Council? What are the lessons and insights from that? But also, what do you recognize in the way that other organizations, without naming names, the way that they're operating that needs to change in that lack of joint analysis or ignoring certain factors, political factors especially?
Thank you very much. Straight into the hardest question, maybe one of the more difficult questions. Indeed, I think one of the benefits of working with an NGO and also with the type of NGO that we operate in with the Danish Refugee Council, as you mentioned, is the fact that we do already have a basis to be covering 5 core sectors. We cover protection, durable solutions, area programming, humanitarian disarmament and peace building, shelter and livelihoods, camp management and camp coordination. So we're already covering quite a spectrum, and there is therefore already a kind of it's actually both in our strategic overview and framework, but we have a collaborative effort across those sectors already to be able to ensure that these types of multi-needs assessments are done collectively and conducively. And I do think that there's 2 things that come out from that. One, identifying the fact that there are limitations and impacts which go across the board which need to be taken into consideration in different thematic areas, but also the fact that, as you've already mentioned, it doesn't mean to say that one organization needs to cover the full spectrum or deliver everything within the humanitarian peace building and humanitarian series. There is a recognition, and needs to be a recognition, of the fact that there are several agencies and actors and players out there, especially national and local actors, who are most importantly positioned and placed to be able to better understand the situation and the context as well, who can carry and are specialized in areas and can be able to ingrain and carry and deliver certain activity sets. So I guess in terms of how that actually works on the ground, and this is, again, I think the biggest issue with this Nexus conversation is the fact that a lot of organizations or a lot of individuals don't understand how to operationalize it. It's a concept still. It's very much this big idea. Yeah. What does it actually mean on the ground? So if I take an example where some of the work that we've done in Somalia, utilizing an example that you've already mentioned, the focus was the fact of working across different organizations, humanitarian agencies and development agencies, because Somalia being what the context it is, there are several components of both sides. And it was not just simply DRC does one conflict analysis and then suggests a whole bunch of recommendations to other organizations. It was done within those areas of speciality. So many agencies were involved in different components. Sharing of the information is extremely important, and then not simply just using it as a tick box of saying, right, we did a conflict analysis, here are the recommendations, and this is how we're going to come together, but actually using them as a basis to be able to ingrain in their program development, in their own strategic thinking, and making sure that they actually took those recommendations on board when developing their own programs. So in that sense, the benefit of this is recognizing, so to speak, this whimsical idea that we're all in theory here for a common goal and purpose, and actually getting down to it and agreeing to work together, which can be helped by things such as use of consortia and setting up situations where if it's a requirement from donors, certainly there's a financial aspect to that as well, and multi-mandated organizations to come together for that. The challenges with this, of course, is that, as you mentioned already yourself, the modus operandi is to stick within what you understand and what you know, what you've been doing for the last 50 years. Right. It's very difficult to break beyond that concept of how do we do something slightly different. There are frameworks, there are tools which can be used to be able to support that, and I think getting that awareness, understanding out there, and things such as a conflict-sensitive approach is one core method to be able to break past this idea that we do operate in silos and that there are so many different facets to any type of conflict before, during, and after a conflict.
Right, but I think what Hervé was talking about, one of the things he was talking about was doing that from the get-go. So having that part of the original design, it was to sit together and actually share the perspectives and each component understanding the considerations, concerns, et cetera, of the other. Often that's not happening at the right moment. You have humanitarian assistance that's often the first ones on the ground. I was talking about protracted conflicts where they overlap, but in many cases, humanitarians are there first. They're not convening with the political actors to understand the different issues that are at play. The incentives, we're going to come back a lot on the incentives here. The incentives are not aligned for them to take the time to actually do that, because it does take a little bit more time, although I think it's a fallacy to say that it takes too long to do this properly. But the key question I have for you, Hannah, is to what extent, in the example that you're giving, to what extent are the Somalis involved in that analysis? We're talking about having joint analysis between external actors, but to what extent are the national actors integrated in such efforts, also in the EU?
In my opinion, they absolutely need to be the core of it. They are the ones who are driving it. If you're talking about community-driven and research and analysis to be able to understand, it has to be driven from communities that you're either trying to directly work in or working around. And also, it's not just therefore taking it at a very, very local level. You also then need to be able to take into consideration the dynamics that are taking place at the regional, but also across state lines, things like that, and boundaries of conflict. So
why doesn't it happen enough?
Why isn't it happening enough? Because it is complicated, and therefore it's, I think, very difficult to be able to manage and understand and how to be able to do it quickly. It is possible, I certainly do believe it, and as you said, there is this common fallacy that comprehensive conflict analysis or situational analysis is a long-standing activity. It isn't. It doesn't have to be, and also if it's being done regularly enough in a manner that's integrated, it doesn't take that much time and has the benefits to be able to be rolled out holistically. Some of the work that we've done actually in Somalia is the fact that we actually we trained and gained insight from both national universities but also local communities to be themselves the researchers and themselves doing the conflict analysis and taking those experiences and stories to be able to understand these connectors and dividers at a much more granular level.
Yeah.
It is possible. It is maybe a different approach and a different understanding, but it certainly is, I would argue, maybe a more effective manner to be able to really understand.
If we can just stick with this point before we go to the next topic. Hervé, are there incentives for the actors not to do joint analysis in the way that the system is currently designed?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I do not know if there is no incentives, but I think the element of incentives to share analysis is the key element, and I think there are two elements depending on you describe the complexity of a conflict. I recall when we first put echo boots in the Sahel in the 90s with the first the Tuareg rebellions. We were probably the first ones to get a better understanding of the local dynamics in the Niger River Valley and how the different communities interacted. I think this knowledge of this fine and granular knowledge of the inter-community dynamic, the peace and conflict resolution mechanism, we had them, and probably over time it got lost. It got lost into the bigger politics when the development programs came in, where we had to convince the Bamako authorities that they should do a special program for the north. So I would say the lens was no longer on the micro, was on a different. And then when we come to different stages of what happened into the Sahel, the lens was a different one. It was about migration, it was about terrorism. So the fine knowledge of what are the drivers and push factors for the communities, what is changing their calculus in terms of securing and economic livelihoods, their security. We lost, I would say, the focus on that ball somehow. And I think this is where it could be actually the ball that every eye should be looking at and trying from the different perspective to get sort of a more, the incentive, if you want, would be here for me, that we should all look at that dimension of the people at the center and do this conflict-sensitive analysis, but together, and I would say not just from the macro, as we too often do it, but keeping it at the micro. And I think this is what helps. There is always, different layers, but too often the local tend to disappear at the expense of the national and even more, wider considerations.
Just to build on that, now we're going to move to Erica, but just to build on that, in our experience, whenever we've seen regional strategies, we've actually been quite worried because they tend to lose the specificity of each country's issues, one, and two, the theories of change about how you actually address them, which tend to be local or national, even if it has regional dynamics. But the international community comes in because it seeks simplicity and will come at it from a regional perspective and lose some of that specificity that you're talking about. Erica, on the issue of sanctions, now we're talking about sanctions a lot these days, including in the other room where they're doing a session that's relating to sanctions, but thinking about the Sahel and other cases right now, to what degree is the approach to sanctions making this coherence of a peace and humanitarian agenda difficult?
That's a great question. And when you were mentioning that the majority of conflicts today are protracted and the amount of time it's taking for humanitarian actors and, of course, development actors as well to deal with conflict-related settings, it's exactly the same when it comes to sanctions, of course. A large percentage of sanctions that are employed are in conflict settings, particularly those of the UN. But what we're also seeing is in some of these very protracted, complicated crises and conflicts, we're seeing an increasing complexity of sanctions, autonomous or unilateral and multilateral, often overlayered in some very complicated, messy webs. And this makes it, incredibly difficult for humanitarian organizations to work out what they can and can't do in terms of blocking or delaying payments. We've been hearing some of the other speakers in other panels talking about de-risking. Financial sector de-risking, which is where banks and other organizations withdraw their services or curtail actually their access to certain countries. And so we have a problem nowadays where sanctions are in place often to tackle very important security and foreign policy considerations, human rights abuses, and so on. But at the same time, because of this complexity that's in place and because of the wide-ranging impacts of de-risking, that can permeate to many different levels and sectors that are really still poorly understood, you end up with something of a vicious cycle. Because in the very conflicts and contexts and communities where the ambition is to enact a whole-of-system approach, the triple nexus, build up resilience and so on, we're seeing a decrease of resilience. If we take the example of financial sector de-risking. If we think about countries like Syria or Afghanistan, in part because of the sanctions and in part because of other factors, the entire countries or certain communities in particular, particularly vulnerable communities, find themselves increasingly isolated from the international financial system. And as a consequence, we have a situation whereby increasing numbers of countries around the world are now being isolated from global banking channels and so on, And this, of course, can directly contribute to fragility within vulnerable communities. We know, for example, that it not only can serve as a driver of conflict through increased poverty, through increased susceptibility to things like modern slavery and human trafficking and so on, it can also serve as a barrier to a return to meaningful diplomatic negotiations. And so the very measures that are imposed to try and deal with a conflict that's in place can sometimes be contributing to their continued existence.
And reinforce inequalities that are often at the source of a lot of the grievances that communities have in the first place.
Yeah.
So reinforce conflict in a way. But then are there more sophisticated, first, sanctions are often a blunt instrument in a way, and somewhat of an easy instrument for outside actors to employ when they can't be seen to be too close to a situation, or they haven't figured out often how to support a population without supporting the government. We're seeing that in Afghanistan. We saw that in Burundi some years ago. We're seeing that in the Sahel now. But are there more sophisticated ways of doing that that can actually avoid exacerbating those inequalities? Or should we actually rethink the approach to sanctions quite completely and look at a much more sophisticated, perhaps more surgical approach to applying pressure but not hurting populations?
Sure. Well, those are great questions. I would say that we are certainly reaching something of a crisis point when it comes to global sanctions practice. There's a number of reasons for this. In part, it's because of this increased complexity that I mentioned. In part, it's because of some of the developments that have taken place with regard to the use of extraterritorial sanctions, those of a secondary nature that can impact on, have global ramifications rather than more localized or regional implications. And we also have the amplifying effects that I also mentioned on the financial sector. And there are a number of solutions, however, and what we've come to realize is that we have now many decades of scholarship and policy research and assessments and so on that can help us understand how sanctions can be planned more judiciously and taking into account humanitarian considerations. And this starts right at the very root cause of the problem when sanctions are being designed and implemented and adopted. And it also refers to closer cooperation across those different parties that are engaging in sanctions. This could be the UN, it could be the EU, the US, and so on. If I can give the example of some of the work that I've done on Syria, it's very similar to what you were saying before. We spent almost 5 years bringing together humanitarian community, those working on in areas of peace and development as well, the banking community, also those working in technology, fintech, and so on, to try and address the problems that were taking place in Syria where humanitarian actors simply couldn't get their funding into the country because banks were too reluctant to transfer the funds, and the same was happening across remittance platforms, digital payment applications, and so on. And what was really interesting, this was an initiative supported by the Swiss government and the European Commission. And it really did take a number of years before those people sitting around the table felt that there was enough trust that had been established that they could start discussing the matter in a
trust with each other.
With each other, and that they were actually speaking the same language. Because what we found in the first, I would say even year of meetings, was that the different sectors simply didn't understand each other because they were referring to the same problems in very different ways. And what was needed was almost the establishment of a common language. And I think that's something that we need when we're thinking about the triple nexus and so on. The element of trust, there's a huge amount of fear that one party will be caught out or that there will be disapproval and so on. And I think we see that as well when humanitarian actors are working with the security community, military, and so on. And again, it also comes back to the points that Hannah was making to do with awareness raising, capacity building, training. But these are very busy people as well. So it's a big ask to get people from all of these different sectors to take time out from their busy schedules and change the way they're thinking and working. And really, I completely agree that the local involvement is absolutely key as well, and it's something that we don't do well enough in most contexts.
But now this is twice that we've heard on this short panel so far the issue of mistrust. I think I want to dig into this a little bit more in a minute. But also now you're raising the issue of a common language and us understanding one another, understanding one's motives and objectives, as you rightly said, Hervé. And just to offer another way that I've heard this discussed, which is that we need to become more trilingual. Not only have a common language, common phraseology, but also become trilingual. And what I mean by that is that we need, and I think Hervé, you're a good example of that, as are a number of people that we've talked to recently, is that they've had careers that have taken them from development work to political work to humanitarian work and back, and therefore they have a trilingual set of experiences which allows them to more naturally integrate these things. And the problem is, the type of department that you never have on a panel like this is the HR department. And yet they're probably the most important department to have in a conversation like this about how do you incentivize, to use that word again that we heard earlier, incentivize staff from various units to be able to move around and actually encourage them or force them to do so, so that they gain that kind of trilingual experience. So keep that in mind. We'll come back on that issue because in my own experience looking at, for example, UN resident coordinators, the ones that have done it all three tend to be the ones that stand out as stars in terms of their ability to naturally develop and implement complex agendas in complex settings. With that, and talking about complex settings, I'm glad that we're joined by Angelica Broman from IOM. Thank you for being with us. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you well, thank you. And I'm really sorry I can't be with you in Brussels, but
okay.
I hope you can hear me as well.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Well, thank you for being with us. So IOM is another, like Danish Refugee Council, you're a multi-mandate organization. And so you live the need for integration all the time. It's not always successful, right? Even within an organization as complex as IOM. But can you give us some examples of where you're able to actually create that level of integration, either at the analytical phase or even more interesting at the implementation phase? And what are some of the biggest challenges to achieving that in your experience?
Thank you, Scott. I mean, those are huge questions for an organization that is also working, in over 150 countries. So I'll try to respond. I think IOM has from the start, even I joined rather recently, a few years ago, but I hear people who were here at IOM in the 90s, they wonder about the nexus because they feel like they always worked across the humanitarian development and peace, always putting the population impacted by the crisis at the center of the response. And because many of our offices are present during the unfortunate protracted crisis, we're already there. And I heard you mention, and several of the panelists mentioned the word trust. And I think that is what is needed in all relations. When you collaborate with each other, when you understand each other, you need to have the trust. We need to ensure we have the trust of the migrants and the IDPs, the host communities. We need to ensure that we deliver what the population need. And now adhering to those SDAC recommendations on the humanitarian development peace nexus, we think it's even more evident than before that putting people and population first is the heart of the nexus. It's about understanding what the affected population needs. It's about enhancing accountability and providing the right support in collaboration with other actors and ensuring that we are there to accompany the population in crisis. So when you talk about silos between the humanitarian development and peace actors, we sometimes feel that, yes, there might be silos between different people looking at problems from a different angle, but I believe that a lot of organizations, I would even say the majority of them, work very much, on a long-term perspective, trying to strengthen the local structures. So when a crisis hit, be it man-made or, a climate-induced crisis, people can move pretty quickly. I recently came from Zimbabwe, where I was stationed when the hurricane hit a few years back. And the majority of organizations came together to rescue lives accordingly. So they were development workers side by side with, in this case, humanitarian. Not so much peace, but it was also trying to not, as you say, do harm, but actually do better than that. Trying to ensure that we address problems ranging from gender-based violence to conflict in the communities, and ensure that we don't enhance these conflicts when we come with interventions. I can't see the rest of you there, so
Oh, you can't?
you have to stop me. No.
Okay. Well, listen, Angelica.
I'm not sure if you're nodding or shaking your head.
No, we're nodding both physically and inside. Don't worry. But let me just, in order to be as practical as we can in the short amount of time as we can, we know that that's what we should be doing. It's that we're not always achieving that. So what we're trying to get at, the itch that we're scratching at the moment, is to really try to understand why it doesn't happen more systematically with greater intentionality. Yeah. So within IOM, and I had a very, very interesting talk with the deputy DG about her experiences as well with the challenges of making this work, where she cited the need for transforming mindsets, that the mindsets are not there at the moment for that level of integration always, or that we need to stop incentivizing just the one who's able to get to the ground first. The cowboy who's able to parachute in to a situation first is the one who tends to get the funding opportunity to come out of that. So how do we incentivize going maybe a little bit more slowly, although it doesn't have to be very slow, as we said, as Hannah rightly said, but doing it well and ensuring that the quality control on the buy-in of the communities is there before action is taken.
I totally agree with that, and I think that is about being on the ground for a longer time and having that institutional knowledge, engaging with local actors that you build on. So I can cite an example. I do believe it's a lot of a paradigm shift also. I tend to say, from my past, I grew up in Africa, so I see this kind of, here we come from Europe and trying to explain to the rest of the world how life should be lived, rather than listening to what are the best methods for agriculture in a community, what are the customs, and what are the cultural history that actually shapes the ecosystem where you're coming. So I also think it's important to know the country well and know the history and understand the ecosystem. And then working together, I personally like very much the Cadre Partnership, which is a partnership of the Red Cross and a lot of UN agencies that work to strengthen disaster risk reductions. You do joint analysis, as you said before, and I think the more you can actually establish what are the problems and how to address them together, you will also have better solutions.
But can I suggest something, Angelica? Because we've often talked about, and I've been in this game for 25 years myself, this issue of joint analysis, but what we tend to mean when we say joint analysis is joint amongst outsiders. And I think, as we were saying with Hannah, and I think Hervé was giving a great example of that as well, it's really that joint analysis with the affected populations.
Of course.
And so a question back to you is, are our methodologies really attuned to engaging the communities to become co-designers or not?
I think in some ways, yes. We have, as you know, IOM is very fully delegated, so different country offices have different aspects, which is also part of the nexus to respond differently in each context, understanding the context. But we have one example that I thought was, which I like to highlight. Together with Georgetown University, we undertook a 5-year-long study on the Iraqi displaced. We followed 3,500 households continuously with the interviews by people from the community. So the first year, you gather information, you have a participatory approach. And I tend to say that I'm Swedish origin, so if someone comes and knocks on my door in Sweden and says, oh, we're doing a survey from the government and we have all these questions, I might not trust the person and leave all the data, how many people are in my household, etc. I might be a bit, who is this person standing here detecting all this information? But repeatedly, when the same people come and do the same surveys, you become more familiar and you give up more information. And therefore, we were able to also understand the problems better for the reintegration of families coming back. And I think that is something that had been, in my past experience, I know we've done, and when I say we here, it's not only IOM, but development and humanitarian actors, they've done these kind of evidence-based research together with local universities, and I think that is one way forward. I always also think that it's important to actually sit in the villages and engage, even with interpreters, if you don't know the language, to understand more of why and what are the needs. I think it's really, as you say, the difficulties is if you sit in headquarters in Brussels, Geneva, or Paris, and draw up the plans for what should happen, or roll out guidelines and tools for the rest of the world. That is where we really fail. It has to start in the countries.
Well,
and the response might be different in the north of one country to the south. So you really do have to engage with the population. And that takes money and it takes time, but it also shows that you have better results.
Thank you, Angelica. Hervé, just pour rebondir on what Angelica was talking about, you were saying that often that engagement, that knowledge, that wisdom from below is there, but it gets lost over time. The kind of experience that Angelica is talking about is one where the communities are helping to design an effort, but what is it institutionally in the EU context that needs to be done to retain that type of understanding through the realities of short-term personnel changes or policy changes or priorities and spotlight changes, as we know to be the challenge. And of course, this comes, and Angelica, I want to come back to you on the issue of also how the funding cycles affect precisely that type of longer-term engagement, because whereas the needs are, and the capacities are all in the long-term, funding and attention spans are always in the short-term. So institutionally, what needs to change to retain that?
I think, from all the experiences I had in different contexts, I think we managed to build a solid body of empirical evidence onto the local dynamics. But it was very empirical, in the sense that there was no onus, there was no incentive to have this part of a template, like, in the teams you may have an expert in water, an expert in health, an expert in shelter. Where is the expert on anthropology and sociology? None. There is no incentive in the system for it. The second, so I'm talking about really the joint analysis at the core. No one has an incentive to look into this, so we have a collective blind spot. The second is, at the level of our action, the different services, the service dealing with security and defense operations, the service dealing with development or humanitarian aid here at the EU, we do joint analysis, but we have each different benchmarks. We all have different benchmarks according to the way we work. Are we able to co-design common benchmarks? Because the benchmarks which are valid for humanitarian aid, they serve the humanitarian aid purpose. So starting from the same joint analysis, and the development will have other benchmarks. Are we able to co-design joint benchmarks? We tried, and here in the room there is Michael Koller, when we were doing in the experience of the Syria crisis, where we observed after several years that the refugees were stranded in Lebanon and Jordan for quite a long while, said, let's develop this so-called joint humanitarian development framework. And we started to design strategies per sector, which were not necessarily the traditional humanitarian benchmark and not necessarily the traditional development benchmarks. But I think that was really key to start to have a joint planning where it was not necessarily what would come naturally to the humanitarian actors. So to bring the people to this, and I think that was also a key to the relative success of, let's say, having a joined up approach. And the fourth, I think, is the third element I would see is to come back to your point, Scott, of this sort of acculturation process. Why not thinking of having someone from the CSDP department in the EAS part of humanitarian operations, even if there is no CSDP operation?
Right.
He could just observe. He could just see how it works. The same way a humanitarian could be part of a CSDP operation, even if there is no humanitarian. But he can see and observe. And I think this is this passerelle that we need to build across the different levels, from the grassroots up to, I would say, the more political level of design of strategies that need to exist. Because I've seen positive stories at all levels, but they were not sustained, they were not systematic. And I think this is where we need now to connect these dots in a more systematic way. I'm quite optimistic that this can be done, but it requires focus and, I would say, a strong political drive to make this happen.
Can I suggest something, actually, just building on that? Was that you're saying there are a lot of positive stories at various levels. Are those actually documented? And I say that in all seriousness, because I think we're all aware of the fairly high-profile negative stories when things have not gone well. But when things go well, they tend to just be unremarkable because they worked well. Yeah? And in peace-building sector, we use a concept of not just doing conflict mapping, but doing peace mapping. That's to look at a society that is in conflict and see within that society, where is it not burning and why? What did the local actors do without any foreign funding, without any of us coming in and saving the day, that actually worked, that kept them together, et cetera? And the peace mapping, what that tells you is that there are solutions that are already there in the country that don't require funding, that are about local resilience or local problem solving and resource organization that you can build upon and actually replicate elsewhere. And in this case, we need to maybe do a peace mapping effort of these types of positive examples of the Nexus in action that aren't extraordinary things that people are aware of, because we're not populating the evidence base around that. That's the first thing. Hannah, just to build on what Hervé was talking about, there is a, in terms of the analytical phase that we're talking about, we're not, what do we need to do to prepare the colleagues, the staff of various agencies to know how to do this?
There was about 16 things that came through my mind when people were speaking that I wish to be able to share, but I'll answer that one first and maybe touch on something that was mentioned already. In terms of what can be done with our colleagues, I mean, it can be as basic as the fact of actually having an understanding and capacity building within conflict sensitivity, not just the principles that we all abide by, but what does it actually mean and how do you do it? And this is something that we as an organization, and I know several other organizations, have taken that upon themselves to be able to do, training humanitarians how to be conflict sensitive. I mean, even going down to basics, unfortunately, I can give probably far too many examples of experiences that I've witnessed where this challenge with humanitarian interventions, not looking beyond just the immediate delivery of an activity and the ramifications after they leave. I unfortunately probably have too many that I can actually mention. But this kind of concepts can be taught, trained. There is a plethora of different manuals and bases to be able to delve into this and understanding these basic concepts, and how to then integrate it into your own programming. It is something that's we as an organization have taken the lead in some countries, in others, it's other organizations who've taken that lead. And so having those types of trainings, and that can even be through, we often in the humanitarian sector, of course, use the cluster approach as our key coordination mechanism. So that is an avenue and an opportunity right there where you already have quite a large breadth of entities who are working towards numerous different goals, in theory, collectively. I do think that this conflict sensitivity is something that is so fundamental and required across the board and is often neglected or misunderstood. And I'll give an example to this, is the fact that if you're talking about this conversation between humanitarian and peace building, especially in my mind when I talk, as you mentioned, about the small p rather than the big P, which is a lot of the work that DRC we do through our peace building programming, there is examples where everything from food distribution or non-food items distributions where items end up going to the wrong individuals who are not meant to be, in theory, the vulnerable populations receiving them, or the use or creation of meter-high barbed wire amongst communities who do not have a history of violence at distribution sites, and therefore children, for example, end up touching because they've never seen it before. Tetanus suddenly becomes an issue. There's a whole bunch of health implications. To cash programming, which then, as soon as they leave a community, violence and conflict breaks out because armed actors in the local area immediately come in afterwards. All these types of interventions, had there been a better appreciation or recognition about the implications, yes, a do no harm approach, certainly, but it's more than that. I mean, do no harm is yes, it's certainly a good principle, but it's a principle, that's the entitlement. It is not about understanding the actual process to get to the do no harm, and that's through the conflict sensitivity and conflict analysis. So it is something that can be trained and taught and understood.
But is the conflict sensitivity, it has become, to a large extent, a box-ticking exercise in many organizations, hasn't it? And we're really talking about moving beyond conflict sensitivity to understand how you can actually contribute to enhancing cohesion. It's what we would call peace responsiveness, going beyond conflict sensitivity. But that hasn't been mainstreamed across most organizations, has it?
Again, probably I would argue that there are certain locations where there's been successes over others, and I mean, you can, and often I think as unfortunately is the case, as even indicated by this conversation, we can all probably give examples of particular projects or particular interventions or particular locations, but holistically, no. There's still a long way to go, I would argue, and not saying that that's not possible. Certainly is something that is possible. It is a mindset shift. It is a framework shift, and moving beyond these concepts of competition and financial requirements and obligations, and there are so many different factors that come into play. It is certainly, there are good examples out there, which again, to your earlier point, yes, they are documented, but how well they're disseminated is probably another aspect to it. But there are examples out there which have shown the value add, and I would agree that a large portion of that, one method to be able to try and get communities, get organizations, donors to be able to better understand the value add is to be able to actually see those documented and disseminated more effectively. That doesn't mean to say that the failings don't need to be also recognized and be learnt from, because there is certainly no need for that too.
Thank you. Erica, we were talking earlier about examples of how the transfer of money can create and deepen actually some inequalities. What are positive examples, to stay on the issue of what are positive, how do we document and bring to the fore the positive examples of where these systems of funding transfers can actually enhance inclusion?
Yeah. Well, I think if I could draw on my recent work on Afghanistan, it could provide quite a good example here. So, as many of you will know, since the resumption of power by the Taliban in the middle of August of last year, Afghanistan has been facing a major banking crisis, liquidity crisis, and so on. And humanitarian organizations and indeed development actors and others in the country have been struggling to access physical banknotes to carry out their humanitarian work. And one interesting idea is for humanitarian actors and governments, donors and so on, to support the digital ecosystem in the country. Efforts have been made already in Afghanistan on this level with limited success. But what I think we need to keep in mind in all of these discussions is that times of crisis can often serve as opportunities. And so I think that it's really important to kind of grab these opportunities when there's a time of great flux in a country or in an organization and so on. And this brings me to the idea of the humanitarian footprint that we were discussing before. There's a great reluctance in the work I was doing with humanitarian actors to make use of some of the innovations that are out there, some kind of tech innovations and so on, digital payment platforms, mobile money and so on. But if humanitarian organizations are able to support a countrywide or at least a regional-wide shift to digital financing within the country, this could lessen the reliance on cash. It could help on a number of other levels with regard to transparency, with the documentation of transfer of funds and so on. And it could lead to a lasting contribution to a country in terms of strengthening the economy and bringing benefits to women and other vulnerable groups. around the country. So there are various examples of this that I've looked into with regard to financially excluded countries across Africa with relation to sanctions and de-risking. And what's really what became visible is that each context requires a very different approach when it comes to potential tech solutions. In some instances, there are innovations already out there in fintech, in govtech, subtech, and so on that could be used already. In other instances, we might think of the example of Syria, where it is so complicated for humanitarian organizations to get money into and around the country. It might be necessary to come up with some new forms of innovation. And I think the more we can think about modernizing approaches when it comes to data collection, monitoring, making assessments, allowing local actors to be involved on a number of levels, but including capturing, what some of the impacts are of the humanitarian action to date. Then I think technology is a really important area that I've seen bring some benefits in certain parts of the world. Of course, with caveats that it can also be a double-edged sword.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're going to wrap up, and we have a last speaker from the floor who's going to offer some insights, and you can come up on stage so that everyone can see you on the camera. But before I do, I just want to pick up. I'm not going to try to summarize this very rich conversation, but I do want to pick up on a number of, I think, deeper points that we talked about that we need to keep alive in the conversation, because we often, I think, gloss over them too easily in the conversations about the nexus and pretend like they're not there, but they are elephants in the room. And I think they have to do with the issues of mistrust between the sectors, between their objectives. I guess Joël, our last speaker, might speak to this, I hope. But there's definite mistrust in the relationship between these sectors that don't understand, perhaps, don't speak the same language. We heard that as well. Don't know how to work together, and certainly don't have the experience that we say we should actually be encouraging of getting people to experience various forms of assistance so that they have a more integrated approach to what they're doing. We nevertheless, as we said, Hannah, we need to be more intentional about how we prepare our people with the skill sets that are needed. I think Angelica was also saying that we need to have an approach that is truly rooted in the country, that is engaging not just between the sectoral intervenants, but also with the local populations to make them an integrated part of that, both analysis and design and implementation. We also heard from Hervé, I think, a very important point that everyone echoed, which is to make sure that the value of the granular understanding of the context at the micro level is not lost when macro-sizing strategies, and that we are too often seeking simplicity, seeking labels and categories and baskets for our work that actually takes us further and further away from what are highly complex situations that require, as Angelica was rightly saying, basically a different approach in each place. And you were saying that as well, Erica. So the common language, the joint analysis, but with that common language comes common benchmarks. These are some of the ingredients that can help to overcome the mistrust between the sectors. Before you take the floor, if I can just ask our colleagues, our 4 speakers here, in 1 minute, what are you going to do a bit differently tomorrow based on what we've been discussing today? Maybe we can start with Hannah.
A lot easier said than done. What are we going to do differently? So, I mean, already I think that there's been, if I talk about internally in terms of my organization, we already have made quite big strides about ensuring that there's cross-sectoral approaches to and understandings across our board, and we do that internally. I also do happen to sit on the mine action area responsibility within the cluster system, and it is a conversation that we've been having increasingly, not just within our own area of responsibility, but also with the general, the global protection cluster as well. And increasingly there is conversations regarding how to better synergize and work together in a more collaborative manner and share experiences and analyses in a more holistic manner at the global, down to the regional and at our national
Share
level
experiences,
and
share
share these
information.
experiences. And I do think that there's a lot of basis to be able to build on that. And I would argue that we're only still scratching the surface with it, and there's a lot more that can be done. So maybe that's
We're
one thing.
encouraged the
I'll
Danish
take it
Refugee
out.
Council will start to do it and inspire everyone else to do it. Hervé, in 30 seconds, what would you say?
I think there is clearly a moment now, an opportunity to look afresh to this, because the hard lesson of Afghanistan and Sahel forces us, leaving no choice, to look again at a so-called stabilization framework and all this. So we need to be honest to ourselves, really do a lessons learned about all this and review our way of doing. Because if we don't do it now, we are bound to repeat the same mistakes. And I think, but I'm hopeful that there are enough people in the system that are willing to change and are willing to look afresh at practices. I think the material is here, is really to try to incentivize in the system this more refined approaches, because on the one hand, it's super complex. We all agree about that, but we have got the tool, we got the knowledge. So how you transform this into policy-making approaches that are more sensitive to it? It's now we have to do it. I mean, if we don't do it now, we will never do it.
Right. Erica, 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, much of my work involves bringing together different sectors, different ways of thinking, different academic disciplines, different cultures, and so on. And so what I would like to do in my own work is to really consolidate what we were talking about today, but actually push for some of these areas that we were discussing, because I think when you're coming from the academic side of the house, we are also divided from this. We're not necessarily that involved with the monitoring and assessment. So I would push for a greater contribution from academia and also from the innovation side of the house, because I think there's a lot that could be done that perhaps isn't being done so far. Thank you.
Angelica, in 20 seconds.
20 seconds. So I think I won't do differently, but I will continue working with the Nexus, ensuring a gender and people-centered approach, enhancing participation from the local stakeholders. And that would mean not participating in panels where there isn't a lot of diversity. Because I know a lot of us have lived in crisis-affected countries in the past, but we are here yet again talking about a population, and that is where we need to start listening to the population. We need to understand what are the real issues for displaced people who have low legal identity, who has no passport, no access to a bank account, no access to education. We need to start looking at this differently, and we need to engage better with the people we want to accompany and enhance their participation. Sorry, that was all.
No, perfect. Thank you very much. Joël, thank you for joining us. We started late, so we still have a few minutes. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And just to say, Joël is the director of the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think a lot of what you've been saying speaks to our experience. And I feel although what we do at the Center of Competence, maybe just a word, so it's a collaborative platform that was created by 4 of the biggest humanitarian organizations, so ICRC, MSF, UNHCR, WFP, with the realization that there is no space, a critical space where actors can share their experience when it comes to frontline negotiation and access matter. So very much in vein of creating a collaborative space across organization that goes beyond mandates. So even and 5 years later, there is over 3,600 members. So to say there is a need for this type of platforms where people can come and share. What we've learned, because I heard a lot of, I was smiling because I think a lot of the obstacles we see now with the Nexus, we already saw them just trying to create that collaboration in the humanitarian sector. No trust, competition, different mandates, confidentiality issues. So all this is there and was there. I think what we've seen from our approach, what helped to overcome some of those obstacles, was really to have a bottom-up approach. So basically creating incentives, because we also looked a lot of what are those incentives. Incentive to individual, to the professional frontline negotiator, who we realize a lot of time feels isolated, doesn't feel equipped to deal with the complexity of today. So how do we create an incentive for that individual to actually join a group of people a group of people where they go on a learning journey. And I think that's how we've seen this community emerging and growing, with creating value at the local level. And I think a key also element we've heard the entire 2 days about the empowering local actors, and I think that's also been key in our journey here, is to see also how through a group of community that comes together, you actually empower local organization, local capacity, and not just overcoming also that risk of transferring the risk to local actors, but how do we transfer the knowledge and how do we transfer the competence. So I think this very organic bottom-up approach has been quite successful, in the sense that we see that there is strong leadership at the very top level, but within the organization, of course, there are not always those incentives for collaboration. But I think at the field level, we've heard it also today and yesterday, if we look at pragmatic approaches, we overcome the silos we have between our different organizations. So yeah, I think just to share also a bit what has been the experience on this specific.
Thank you so much. It's a great way to wrap this up. Thank you for attending this. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. If we can give them a round of applause, please. And thank you, Angelica, for joining us online. Thank you.